I have a radical idea that we start 3 minutes early. And that way we'll squeeze even more goodness out of this session. And when we get to the end, we'll all appreciate it. I've been told to speak slowly. I won't be able to keep that up for very long, I promise you. Well, I have this to help me now. Good afternoon. It's an absolute pleasure and an honour to speak to you. My name is Tom Bennett, and for the last 2 or 3 years, I've been the English government's Behaviour Advisor, or Behaviour Czar, as the press very kindly dubbed me, which is great. When else will you be called a czar in your life? So I was very pleased to hear that. And also for the past 4 or 5 years, I've been running researchED. And for the past 15 years, possibly more importantly, I've been a classroom practitioner in schools in London. So that's been kind of my career potted CV. I want to talk to you today about a report that we recently wrote for the UK government. And it was commissioned by the Secretary of State, and they wanted me to look into leadership and behaviour. Leadership and behaviour. What was it that the best schools were doing in terms of leadership to maximise the types of behaviour we want to see in schools and in classrooms? Now, prior to this, we'd written a report on initial teacher training and what teachers needed to be trained in order to be as classroom ready as possible in terms of classroom management or behaviour management. I prefer the term classroom management. When you say behaviour management, I don't know how that sounds to your ears, but in the UK, behaviour management sounds like you're trying to stop somebody from fighting, which often you are. But classroom management to me suggests more of a kind of a skill, a craft, and an art of how you run a room. You see, I knew I shouldn't have started early. You didn't miss anything. I've just been warming up. So I prefer classroom management. I prefer the idea that you're running a room with all of the interpersonal skills that entails. Now, what I find really interesting is that when it comes to initial teacher training, in the UK certainly, the initial teacher training for behaviour management is not particularly great. And the reason why I say that isn't to say that all training is bad, but rather that it's too patchy. There are some schools and institutions doing some great work and some not doing great work. And as with a lot of pedagogy, I think a lot of what we do is simply, you're lucky if you pick up good behaviour management. You're lucky if you pick up good pedagogy, if you've been given a good mentor and so on. And I think we can do better than that. And when I started teaching 15 years ago, I think as I mentioned earlier on, previously I was running nightclubs in the West End of London. You know, I was reasonably confident, and I'd seen lots and lots of very, very challenging people, as you can imagine. And I thought that would be immediately transferable into the classroom, and how wrong I was. How wrong I was, that these skills were very domain specific and they were not the kind of things that transferred easily. So, very unsatisfactory. So we wrote a report which we called Creating a Culture. It's a reasonably short report, it's about 50, 60 pages, lots of diagrams, and it's also free, it's available to download online. So if you go to Department for Education UK, Tom Bennett, Creating a Culture, you'll find it there. And it's a piece of work that took us about a year to construct. It's very deliberately a piece of practitioner-informed evidence, which is to say that I am not a school leader. And one of the things that's very, very important to do is not to go out with of your own boundaries. I know a lot about teaching behaviour, but I'm not a school leader. So I spoke to school leaders. And what we did was we went up and down the United Kingdom, and we went to schools where the demographic was challenging, but the behaviour was excellent, which we thought was far, far more interesting and far, far more powerful than going to schools where the behaviour was excellent simply because of a particularly fortunate intake or demographic. There are lots of schools you'll go to, particularly in more affluent areas, where the children turn up on your doorstep with lots and lots of cultural capital, fantastic vocabulary, great self-regulation, great manners, and all these kind of things. And the school doesn't do very much to achieve good behaviour in the school, but it all runs quite well because they're very lucky to have those types of children. And then there are other schools, and these are the schools which I primarily worked in, where the demographic was a lot more challenging. Normally, far higher levels of poverty, single-parent families, and all the other correlations that normally kind of coalesce to create circumstances where behaviour becomes more challenging. Also, for example, circumstances where the primary schools weren't so good, and children were coming to the school with less subject knowledge, and therefore falling further and further behind, and turning to misbehaviour as a way of compensating or coping with the fact that they couldn't access the lessons. So these are the types of schools we looked at, and we looked at coastal schools, rural schools, we looked at urban schools, we looked at high schools, junior schools, early year, and so on. We tried to look at as many as possible. We visited the schools, we conducted a literature review, we interviewed academics, we had structured interviews with the head teachers, and we also commissioned a separate piece of research, which is running parallel to us by Ask Research, which was independent and used as a kind of a counterbalance to see if it agreed, and it did, which was great. Thank you just for that. So I want to just talk about the general field of kind of evidence-informed practice when it comes to behaviour management or classroom management. Classroom management in the United Kingdom particularly, and increasingly I find internationally, the more I investigate this, is a field which is overwhelmingly, I could say, infected by ideology and driven by values. Which is to say that a lot of the things that people believe when it comes to behaviour management is often informed very much by how they think children should behave and what they think should work when it comes to creating stable and supportive classroom cultures. A lot of the things I was taught as a training teacher, for example, were essentially what I called earlier on folk teaching, traditional teaching, the kind of the wisdom of the herd, as it were. I was told many things, such as, for example, you have to make them like you. Maybe you've been told that before. Or if you make them laugh, they'll behave for you. Things like this drive me mad, because they're very well meant. And people who say these things are trying to help you. But it's about as useful as, have you ever been in a circumstance, I beg your pardon, are you classroom teachers? Put your hand up if you're a classroom teacher. Oh, okay, my people, thank you, good. A school leader? Something else? Haven't put your hand up yet? Somebody always puts their hand up for the haven't put their hand up yet. I don't know why they do that. Thank you. One at the back. If you ever walk into a staff room, any staff room, and you've had a terrible day with the kids, they've been running around you in circles, no work's been done, and you sit down and you say, oh my God, that grade 9 class is killing me. And somebody comes over and says, well, they behave for me. Someone says they behave for me. Like that's helpful. Or have you tried making them laugh and so on. So there's a lot of that. Teacher training in the United Kingdom is often very much an afterthought to your training. Or it's seen as something that you pick up as you go along. And again, I don't know if this resonates with you in your own training experiences, but it seems to be, from our international comparisons, it seems to be quite common that behaviour management is often seen as something which you'll just pick up in school and doesn't need to be taught formally. I completely disagree. Sometimes the things you'll be taught will also make things worse for you. The advice you'll be given will be, as I say, damaging to your behaviour management, your classroom management. I'm going to suggest that to be good at behaviour management, what we found in the best schools is that you need to have a very conscious strategy about how you're going to create good behaviour in a classroom, as well as building upon the craft and experience of yourself and the wisdom of people around about you. And in fact, to be fair, we could say that about any aspect of education. That if we have evidence-informed craft, rather than just craft by itself, or indeed just theory by itself, then what we have is something very powerful. And where those two things overlap, I'm going to suggest, is a very exciting project for the future. I'm also going to suggest that in order to understand how we should be running classrooms and what we should do to improve behaviour, we need multiple data points. It is not enough to go into one school with one type of student and teach those students and say, well, that's going to work in a different school or a different classroom. That's not enough. Because, for example, you could be working with older students, for example, who may have developed much higher levels of self-regulation or self-restraint. You might be fortunate enough to work with a very able class. Or you might be working with children who've got particularly high levels of abuse or whatever. Which is to say, if you want to understand classroom management, you have to see lots of different contexts and schools and so on. And if I'm honest, I got far better at behaviour management myself, personally, as a practitioner, the more classrooms and schools I went to. I've been very fortunate to see lots and lots of schools by now. Secondly, sorry, I'm just surprised to see rain in Australia. I think it's the first time I've ever seen it. I didn't know you had it here. I feel at home now, which is lovely. I'm going to relax. Also, when behaviour management is being trained at a school leadership level or a classroom level, it is essential that the trainee is instructed in multiple strategies. Once again, this ties into the idea that we need multiple data points to understand how to achieve good behaviour. That there are different ways in which you can achieve good behaviour, and different strategies may work with different groups. And that context in education is everything. That when you're dealing with people and the complex interpersonal relationships which that entails, it is insufficient to say X intervention will produce Y of an outcome. Yeah? And I think actually I saw some excellent talks earlier on from Dr. Tanya Vaughan and so on, that we need to get away in education of this idea that there is one solution that will fix everything that we want to happen. Also, when it comes to the types of evidence we look at for behaviour management, it's crucial to avoid just small case studies or anecdotes or indeed our own personal experience. It's very important to try and go beyond that. So I'm kind of repeating myself slightly there. And finally, this is one piece of advice which a lot of the school leaders were telling us when we did our research, which was often a lot of advice you'll get about behaviour management comes from people who have never taught in a classroom. Right? Now, that's not to say it's without value. There's been some very credible research done into classroom behaviour management by people who have never taught. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when somebody tries to convince you with their own versions of folk or tradition teaching or anecdotes and so on, and they'll tell you what should work. Classroom teachers have got a very domain-specific type of role. Okay. Some popular behaviour myths, and again, these things came up time and time again when we spoke to people who were actually successful in classrooms. And number one was that you needed to get them to like you. Now, this is a classic example of mistaking correlation with causation. Let me explain. Very often, and you'll know this yourself, if you have a class where the behaviour is excellent, and they're working hard, and they're doing very, very well, and they respect you as a teacher, and they know that you're working hard too, and that you're doing your best for them, and that you care for them, and so on, and so on. Very often they will like you, or they will respect, there will be a professional regard for you. They might think that, you're hard. They might think that you're tough, but there will be a professional respect for you. But that's not to say that you just have to make them like you to achieve that. That's putting the cart before the horse. That's the correlation rather than the causation. Or perhaps even you could suggest that it's looking at causation the wrong way around. That when you achieve all the things that you need to do to achieve good classroom management, you will get them liking you eventually down the line. I've even had pupils excluded from school who had to be excluded for violence and so on. And years down the line, they've said, thank you. It's what I needed at the time. I realised now that I was being an idiot and so on. I mean, it doesn't happen often, but it has happened. And I find that extraordinary. And then the next big myth we came across, if I could get rid of one, it would be this. People telling you there's no such thing as a badly behaved lesson, only a poorly planned lesson. Now, the implication of this, of course, is that if the children misbehave, it's your fault. And if the children misbehave, it's because of some poor practice or pedagogy which you were doing or something you weren't doing. Now, let me just add one caveat. Poorly planned lessons don't help. Poorly planned lessons will make things more difficult for you. If your lesson is deliberately confusing, if your lesson is pitched way too high for the children, if you're not listening to the feedback you're getting and so on, yes, you will give them more opportunities to misbehave. Of course that's true. But the planning itself is not necessarily the root cause of it. And teachers are, I find teachers to be quite a nice bunch of people. I mean, like I said, my previous career was running nightclubs, so I don't have much of a comparison. The teachers are certainly quite nice people compared to that. And I find that they often blame themselves for issues which sometimes they can't control, particularly new teachers, particularly teachers who are new to a classroom and who are told things like this. There's another thing about behaviour. which is that often people say that we need to use more technology to achieve better behaviour. Again, all the best practitioners and best school leaders, the thing they routinely tell me is that if you can't achieve good behaviour without the use of technology, you certainly won't be able to achieve it with good technology. What you might be able to do is to pacify them. What you might be able to do is to do the classroom equivalent of putting Xanax in their lessons and just get them kind of occupied. But being occupied doesn't mean being focused on learning and so on. So tech can be used very well, but it's often used as a baby's dummy, a pacifier or something. There's another huge and hugely inappropriate thing which people think, which is, oh, you can't expect that child to behave because they're badly behaved. And you can see the obvious kind of logical fallacy of that statement, which is that if you already believe a child can't behave, then you'll act in such a way that they can't behave, which means you won't do what it takes to get that child behaving again. So and obviously it leads to writing children off. That child is poor, that child comes from that family, that child comes from that group, they won't behave. Or they're so far behind, you should focus on other children and so on. And then finally, there's a very curious thing which I've encountered time and time again since I've been writing and training in behaviour, which is that I often get people saying to me, oh, sanctions don't work. Rewards don't work. Sanctions and rewards certainly don't work if that's all that you use. If you have nothing but a strictly behaviourist approach to children. In the same way that, for example, let's take a lovely park. There's lots of parks in London, royal parks particularly. You're not allowed to walk in the grass. It belongs to the Queen. Only the Queen gets to walk in this grass. So there'll be a little sign on the grass which says, do not walk in the grass. Now, how do we make sure that people don't walk in the grass? Well, it's not just by punishing them. We don't prevent people from walking in the grass by putting them in the Tower of London, which is, I assure you, where everyone goes, or by giving them a present or a treat if they don't go in the grass. There are lots and lots of ways in which we can achieve this without sanctions and rewards. But I assure you, sanctions and rewards are an utterly essential part of every behavioural system, in every school I've ever seen, in every classroom I've ever seen, which has good behaviour without just having an excellent demographic. I assure you of that. That at some point you need to be able to reprimand and castigate a child and say that behaviour wasn't good enough. And as a result, you are going to lose this reward or something, or you're going to have some small sanction or whatever. As Bill Rogers, who's from here, in fact, he's very close to here, frequently says, the severity of the sanction is far, far more important than the certainty of the sanction is far, far more important than the severity of the sanction. You don't have to beat a child to achieve the same effect that a good reprimand can have. In fact, I would invite you not to beat children. That's probably not a great thing, not a great look. Okay. I also just want to define a couple of things here. As with anything, we have to define our terms. What do we mean by good behaviour? I'm going to suggest, following Berlin with his ideas of negative and positive liberty, that we can suggest negative and positive good behaviours. The negative good behaviour is when you encourage children to stop doing the things you don't want them to do. It's when you encourage children to not fight each other, not swear, to not push people over and so on. But positive good behaviour goes beyond that. And positive good behaviour is very simply inculcating excellent habits or habits of character within children so that they routinely act in a certain way which you would want them to behave. For example, the ability to talk to somebody much senior to them, the ability to be polite even in circumstances where they don't want to be polite. Or it could be an academic good behaviour. It could be how you work in a group. It could be how you present a debate. It could be something like that. So when I talk about good behaviour, I talk about both, and both are essential. And again, many, many teachers are very, very keen on the second one. They want children to be all these lovely things, like kind and sharing and so on. And I do too. But you very rarely achieve that without the first one. That you do also have to focus on a little. This is what upsets a lot of people when you talk about expecting children to comply. I do expect children to comply. I think that's an utterly rational and utterly reasonable thing to expect of a child. And I sometimes worry that I have to defend that. And it's not because I want them to be robots and automatons and so on. It's because we teach them things for their own good so that they can then become independent adults. And that you don't achieve that independence, you don't achieve that agency and that autonomy without first learning the habits of self-restraint. And we all know that self-regulation and the ability to restrain oneself is one of the key indicators of later life success. If you cannot stop yourself from going out to, a bar or a movie or something when you should be studying or working or painting the house, you won't achieve very much. And nothing was ever achieved without the type of effort that requires us to frequently do that which we would not do, in a sense. Anyway. So, is there a problem? I'm going to talk about the UK just for a second here. In the UK, is there a problem? Weirdly enough, if you look at lots of really high-level global reports, there's no problem at all. 75% of schools in the UK are rated good or better in terms of behaviour. Wow, it must be great to teach in England, right? And it is. I love teaching, but it's also not that good in terms of behaviour. There are some excellent schools, and there are some terrible schools. And there's lots of schools in between. And what we found was when we looked at evidence gained by external inspectors, they were normally very, very positive and very rosy. And I'm not surprised, because our internal inspectorate, which is called Ofsted, visits a school for 1 or 2 days and really just takes a snapshot of behaviour. And of course, it's like the old story about the Queen. The Queen thinks that the whole world smells of paint because everywhere she goes, everything's freshly painted. That's kind of what applies to Ofsted inspectors too. They come in, and a great many schools will hide their most badly behaved children on school trips or just send them home. I've seen schools where difficult members of staff have been sent home for Ofsted inspections. It's a game that can be gamified very easily. But when you look at, for example, teacher surveys, when you look at grassroots surveys, when you look at data gathered by, for example, the unions, and obviously there are biases in these surveys too, the picture is far, far less rosy. And thankfully, even Ofsted itself has started to wake up to this and realised that its own data on this isn't particularly good. And so they've even published some reports. There was one published in 2015 called Under the Radar. And it was very, very, very encouraging to see that our inspector had noticed this. Yeah, so, I beg your pardon, sorry. Yes. I'm breaking a cardinal rule of PowerPoints here. Never do this with a presentation. I've seen a lot of these today, and I'm doing one too, so I can't say that I'm doing better than anyone else. I just put this up here. This is the kind of data we normally see. 77% of teachers feel that student behaviour at their schools was good or better. 87% felt they were well equipped. Great. All of that is fantastic news. But the problem is, you flip that around. That means that almost a quarter believe that behaviour isn't good. So a quarter of teachers believe that behaviour isn't good in their school, or at least good. 1 in 8 teachers don't feel equipped to deal with behaviour. A half believe they can't access the appropriate training. 1 in 3 felt they couldn't even discuss behaviour with other members of staff. Now, I know that sometimes the comparison with medicine is a bit tiresome, but humour me. Imagine when we're talking about doctors in hospitals. Imagine 1 in 3 doctors felt they couldn't discuss medical problems with members of staff, or half of them felt they hadn't been trained well enough, or 1 in 8 felt they couldn't do it. Now, that's terrifying. I'm going to suggest that medicine is incredibly important. I'm going to suggest education is equally important because it's spread throughout your entire lifetime. And that there are 2 levels of need we need to talk about here. There are 2 levels of need which need to be addressed in order for classroom behaviour to be improved substantially. And that is at the level of the leader and at the level of the teacher, the classroom. Or you could say the level of the cell and the level of the organism. And the organ is somewhere in between, perhaps middle leadership and so on. I'm also going to suggest that, and this is an anecdote or an anecdotal experience, I'm going to suggest that when you improve the behaviour of a school, you massively improve every other successful aspect of the school that you want to achieve. Every other aspect. Do you want children to be more creative? Improve the behaviour. Do you want children to get higher grades? Improve the behaviour. Do you want children to do more extracurricular activities? Improve the behaviour. And so on, and so on, and so on. There are simply some things you cannot achieve unless the behaviour is good or better. And learning is one of them. I've met some teacher trainers who say that a noisy classroom can still be a learning classroom. The vast majority of times that's simply not true. That's simply not true. It's a falsehood of enormous magnitude. Of course, there are some activities you want them to do which will be inherently noisy. I'm going to suggest an orchestra might be one of them, or group work, or discussion work, and so on. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that by and large, the most efficient way for students to learn is through things like structured direct instruction, which of course, as we've been learning through other sessions today, does not simply mean a lecture like this. So I apologise. This isn't very interactive. Okay. Can I just say, one of the things I love about teacher training, I've been to teacher training lectures telling me how good group work was. Just let that sink in for a second. I've been to lectures telling me that group work is the best way to learn. So you're sitting there thinking, well, why aren't we doing it? For our initial teacher training report, again, which is available to download online, so I won't bore you with the details, but essentially we came down to three things. There are three things that teachers need to know in order to be even reasonably classroom ready. But it's useful to look at them separately. And the most important one are routines. And by a routine, I mean find a behaviour in your classroom that you want to be roughly the same all the time. Let me give an example. How do you want them to enter your classroom? Do you want them to line up? Do you want them to stand in pairs? Do you want them to enter the classroom immediately and begin a task? Do you want them to enter the classroom immediately singing the song, clapping their hands, holding breath in their cheeks? Who knows? It doesn't matter to me, which is why I talk about a range of strategies. The question is, what do you want? What behaviour do you want? What behaviour do you think is going to be useful to you and to their learning? Once you've identified that routine, you then need to communicate that routine to the class. Easily done. Tell them. But then you need to ensure and guarantee that routine, not so easily done. This is the bit most teachers fall down on. They know what behaviour they want to happen, but they're not very good at implementing it and then maintaining it. So I'll give an example. I've been to lots of schools in the UK where they do this really well. They've decided that they want the pupils to line up or come straight in. And then they'll practice it right at the start of their school careers. Now, it sounds incredibly boring. It sounds like, oh my God, really? You're going to waste kids' time doing that? This is not a waste of time. We call this front loading. You front load the social expectations. You front load the routines you want to inculcate in the children. And then you practice those routines. And here's the interesting thing. When you practice a routine, it becomes a habit. And once something becomes a habit, it becomes internalized. And once it's internalized, it becomes part of your character. This is basic Aristotelian ethics here, if anyone likes the philosophy. But it's true. In the same way, the way that you brush your hair, which for me is quite quick, or the way you brush your teeth, or the way you walk, or your accent, these are all habits which you have to consciously break if you want to break them. You have to think, I'm going to brush my teeth the other way today. But normally we just fall into a certain pattern. You want the children to be habituated into the classroom routines that you find beneficial. So that's good. The second part is responses. You need to learn or teach your children what to do when things go wrong. And they will. Even if your routines are excellent, even if you've really, really helped your children understand what routines you want, things will still go wrong. People will be late. People will be rude. People will forget their manners. People will blah, 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 blah. So what do you then do? I won't go into too much detail about it, but I will say one thing. One of the most useful things you can do as a teacher is to get ready for what will happen when things go wrong. Were I to ask you, and I do this in some courses sometimes, were I to ask you what kind of things can go wrong in a classroom, we could probably write them down in about 5 minutes, 20 different things. And we'd probably agree on about 19 of them. You know, somebody could be rude, somebody could speak out of turn, somebody could fight, somebody could not be working very hard, and so on. So given that there are a finite number of things that probably go wrong, The very simple thing that we must be doing as teacher educators or school leaders of education is to say to teachers, okay, what are you going to do? Tell me now. Roughly, what will your range of responses be? So that when the misbehaviour happens, you're not like a rabbit caught in the headlight thinking, oh my goodness, there's somebody setting fire to the curtains, what shall I do? And incidentally, in my very first week of teaching, I had a teenage boy who pulled a can of, do you have Lynx deodorant here? Or Axe? Something like that, yeah. I don't know what the makers of Lynx thought smelled worse than Lynx, but it's pretty awful. Anyway, so they brought this can out. And of course, you know, you've probably seen this happen occasionally. And you say, you know, don't put that away. I don't want to see that. That's not what should be in the classroom. And then he pulled out a cigarette lighter. Right? And I really looked at it and thought, no, he's not. And he did. And he turned it into a flamethrower in the classroom. I know that makes British school sound dreadful, doesn't it? It was a really bad school, I promise you. And I didn't know what to do. This had never been taught. This was never discussed in teacher training. What if someone pulls out a flamethrower? And I literally froze. And then he walked out the classroom. And it took me like a few days to kind of process what had happened, what I should have done, and so on. The head teacher was appalled when I eventually told him. It's a long time ago. So your responses, get used to it. Get over the rabbit in the headlights moment. And then finally, relationships. I won't go into that just now. Only to mention that tends to be what teachers mistakenly aim for first. They try to artificially engineer a relationship. And here's the truth that I come up with time and time again. If you work on your routines and good responses, alongside other things, you will build a really good relationship with your pupils. And the relationship will not be a friendship. And the number of times I have to tell new teachers this, they're not your friends. You care for them. You have unconditional positive regard for them. You are their teacher. There is a name for the relationship. Their mentor, their guide, whatever you want to call it, but their teacher is fine by me. And that's a very beautiful and unique relationship, and that's the one we work on. And we achieve it by doing the first two. And we achieve it by understanding who they are and by talking to them and so on. But we don't aim for it directly. You can no more achieve a relationship directly with your children than you can, for example, make somebody love you by saying, I intend you to love me. So I will do loving things. I will bring you roses. I will treat you especially well. That doesn't make somebody love you. Relationships cannot be forced in that way. Relationships have to be sincere and authentic. And the teacher relationship is built on trust. And trust is generated by routines. The reason why I called my leadership report Creating a Culture is because that's exactly what you have to do. Is that the successful school leader decides the type of culture they want to have in their school and consciously and continuously creates and recreates it. The same applies for classroom teachers. You decide what kind of culture do I want to have. By culture, which can mean a lot of things, all I mean is this is the way we do things around here. This is how we typically act. These are the values that we typically embody. And once you consciously decide that, then you communicate it and then you maintain it. It's a simple structure. It's difficult to do in practice. Why? Because it takes a lot of effort. And every single head teacher I saw, every single school leader I saw that was successful at this had enormous levels of energy and willpower and enthusiasm. This does not happen by itself. Or rather, culture does happen by itself, but it won't be the culture you want. I mean, look at, for example, this room. Everyone's being very, very well behaved. I'm very grateful for that. Nobody's shouting at me. And inside your head, you might be thinking, he's wrong, but you're being kind enough not to say that. And it might just be the lunch, waiting us all down. But a lot of classroom environments don't have people possessed of that level of self-regulation. The culture here regulates itself because everyone here roughly knows what they should be doing. You're adults, you're responsible, you're kind, and so on. A lot of children come from environments where the culture is very, very different. For example, where if somebody insults them, it's appropriate to punch back. And that's their culture, and that's what they think is right. Or there might be some children who find that they're far more interested in their peer culture than the classroom culture. Their peer culture, as we all know, is extremely strong. In fact, some people would argue that peer culture influences actually dominate parental culture influences and so on. That especially for adolescent teenagers, it's just enormously important. I've got a 4-year-old daughter, and already I can see her desperate to conform to the norms of her peers. She wants the same clothes, she wants the same toys, and so on. It's just, and some of you may be parents, and you can see your own culture that you've tried to inscribe upon them just drifting away a little bit, and you get really frustrated. How, no, 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 no. And all of a sudden you can understand the Rapunzel myth a little bit better, about why some people want to keep their children locked away in towers. Because all of a sudden you sense this fear, you know you don't have control anymore. It's natural, you can't stop it, but you know, it's there. These were common features of the schools we saw that were most successful. And some of this might seem absolutely in your face obvious. But it's important to be conscious of it. Number one was the clarity of culture. How do we do things around here? Communicating it to the children at the classroom level and at the whole school level. Communicating that to the staff. It's no good expecting your staff to do something if you haven't been clear with them about it in the first place. And it's no good them just understanding what you want telepathically. There's a brilliant quote by a guy called Charlie Taylor, who runs special schools for very, very disturbed children in London. And one of the things he said was that you have to make it concrete for your staff. It's no good having this grand, beautiful vision. You know, at this school we will all flourish and achieve excellence. That means nothing. That means nothing unless you draw a clear picture as to what that would mean. It's almost like saying to your class, I want you to be well behaved today. What does that mean? You have to say to them, I want you to, I don't know, stay in your seats and finish your work or whatever. You have to make it concrete. When did we finish here? 20 past. 7 minutes. These slides will be available for anyone to have later on. We've talked about routines, so I'll skip that. I know, plenty of it. I cannot emphasize this enough. If you want to create a culture in your classroom or your school, you have to repeat the norms that you expect to see. Now, social norms are a very, very well researched part of psychology, and the fact that human beings are intensely social animals. And no matter how rebellious you think you are, we are enormously conformist on many levels. And actually we can plug into that and we can use that for good purposes. But what you have to do is make sure you enforce that culture and make sure that you reinforce the norms continuously and repeatedly. If you do not do that, if you are inconstant, if one day you decide that it's okay not to line up, or just, I don't care how you come in today, that inconstancy will dissolve your social norms, and the children will realize that sometimes you can do it one way and sometimes you can do it another. That's not to say that you have to regulate every aspect of the behaviour, far from it. I'm suggesting that successful teachers and leaders regulate the important parts of the behaviour, the ones that count. And as they get older, as they internalise these social norms, they start to, believe it or not, police themselves. And once you've got a terrific classroom culture, where, for example, high achievement is applauded, then the children will themselves drive themselves to some extent, and you just have to kind of make sure that you keep that on the table. So once you've created the culture, you can step back a little bit and focus on other things, and that's the beautiful part. And that's what we're looking for with children. As they get older, we want them to become more autonomous. I want children to go away and study by themselves. I want them to pair off and get into groups and do projects by themselves, which will achieve something greater than I could have done with them. But until they're ready for that, I'll help them build up the habits that help get them there. And again, I think frequently we have a correlation-causation issue here, that we want to see children being really independent and autonomous. We want them to basically become adults. And because of that, we treat them like adults without giving them the skills necessary to become adults. And this, for me, is one of the great failings of a great many schools in the UK. Yeah, I think I'll finish on this actually. A lot of the things that I suggested are useful, like for example, clear routines and so on, or visible leaders and whatnot, or visible leadership. It's reasonably obvious. So another question I asked all the school leaders and classroom teachers is, why don't these things work? What are the impediments to success. Why sometimes don't things work in classrooms and schools? And that was, for me, was just as important. And number one was inconsistency. And here's the thing. If you say to any teacher or school leader, are you consistent? None of them will say no. Everybody thinks they're consistent. If I ask 100 classroom teachers to describe their classroom management style, 101% of them will say firm but fair. Everybody thinks they're firm but fair. Not everyone is. So there's a dislocation there between the data and the reality. And I'm going to suggest it's because we have different interpretations of what firm means and what fair means. And that a school leader or a classroom teacher, your duty is to decide for the community what that's going to mean. Firm but fair. Fair means 100 different things. Firm means 100 different things. You calibrate it. You set where you want. You set what you think is useful. So inconsistency is the poison, is the kryptonite to these kind of situations. Poor communication, contrary routines, doing thing one day but not the other. That's a terrible one. Overburdened by workload. The number of schools I go to where staff are expected to, for example, perform enormous numbers of administrative tasks connected to behaviour management, but do not have the time to successfully do this, is extraordinary. This is a feature of every bureaucracy and every administrative system I've ever seen. Mission creep. The sense that what we always do in big bureaucracies is we add to our workload and we add to our workload, and yet never do we sit at our meetings and say to ourselves, what are we going to stop doing today to make this achievable? And the school leader or the middle leader that doesn't stop to ask themselves, do my staff have time for this? Is essentially creating a rod for their own back, a rod for their staff's back, and they're creating an impossible situation which will never succeed. Workload is everything in education. I don't know what it's like in your own territories, in your own schools. I imagine you're fairly busy. I imagine you don't have a lot of time in the staff room telling other people that they behave for you. Okay? So actually, I'm going to stop there, because the key message I wanted to convey was that the most effective classrooms and schools focus on routines. You get in front of the behaviour before it occurs to minimise misbehaviour. You then work on the responses. The school has to have a clear set of responses. And I do a lot of work on this with schools. And you have to work out what those responses will be. And it's not just about detentions and sanctions, but it must also be about sanctions and rewards. But there are lots of other strategies you can use. If you want pupils to feel valued and valuable and part of the identity of the school, if you want them to identify with the school and think to themselves, I am a member of this community, I am part of this culture, you have to make them feel that being part of that culture is valuable. You have to make them feel valued. You do so by attaching consequences to their actions. If a pupil misbehaves and nothing happens, the pupil thinks, A, I can do it again, B, what I do doesn't matter. Oddly enough, I think that by sometimes getting a child into trouble, you're showing them that you care. That bell suggests that somebody cares about the consequences of my actions. So I'm going to pause right there. I'm available for questions at any time. But thank you very, very much for coming. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm sure that was too early. Yes. I'm going to send them out to anyone that wants them. I'm going to communicate with ACE and just send them out. I'm also happy to enter correspondence.